Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today. Our webinar is how to set up user testing as part of an accessibility program. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. We have a fantastic panel today, starting with Erica Braverman, who is the Community Engagement Specialist with Knowbility. We have Joseph De Niro, who is an Assistive Technology Specialist with Helen Keller Services. And we have our MC, our own Jason Taylor, who is the Chief Innovation Strategist here at UsableNet and advisor to our CEO. And I am going to go ahead and hand it over to Jason to give us the agenda and start the presentation.
Thanks, Bethany, and thanks everybody for spending a little time with us today. Just to set the agenda, but also set expectations. Essentially, what we're going to try to do in this session is bring to you sort of practical advice about how you can include people from the disability community inside your accessibility testing to either improve the testing that you're doing, to accelerate the feedback mechanism that you might be getting from that testing, and talk about some of the different aspects. Now, both Erica and Joe run teams of people who use assistive devices on a daily basis. Those teams are engaged by a wide range of companies to do user testing as part of accessibility testing or accessibility programs. So essentially what we want to do is help people understand how to organize that type of testing. What is the best type of testing that you could do with those users? Maybe outline some of the challenges. So we're going to go through the different types of testing that you could do, and sort of focus in on one of what I would class as 3 types of testing that you might be able to do with that type of disability group. We'll talk about how that'll fit into your current strategy, what you should test, when you should test, what the sort of different options are about when that testing done. And we'll talk about some of the challenges, because it's not as straightforward sometimes as other testing. And we'll talk about resources where you could find different groups of users from different disability groups, depending on the sort of size of your organization and the scale that you need to do user testing with. First, though, I wanted to make sure people sort of understood who we have on the panel. I'm going to basically MC and have Erica and Joseph add their sort of practical day-to-day input. Erica, maybe you could start by just giving a brief background of your role at Knowbility, and also the sort of the structure of people with disabilities as a sort of service that you can provide through Knowbility, or through, I know there's another subgroup called Access Works. If you could just explain that to us, Erica.
Sure. Thanks so much. And I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Erica Braverman, and I'm part of Knowbility, which is actually a nonprofit focused on digital accessibility. And the Access Works program is mainly focused on recruitment from a database that we maintain of users with different disabilities who want to do paid user experience testing. And so what we can do, we work with our clients to make sure that we're recruiting the people they're looking for. We can answer questions about, how many people do I recruit, things like that. And then we can also offer support with developing the user test, moderating the test, and collecting the data.
Great. And Joe, I know you're probably the busiest person on this panel, and you have 2 roles which are relevant really in this discussion. So maybe you could give us a brief description of what you do for Helen Keller and also what you do for UsableNet.
Thank you, Jason. No, I'm lazy. So my name is Joseph De Niro. I am an assistive technology specialist with Helen Keller Services for the Blind. I provide instruction to individuals from teenage students to adults, to specifically low vision and totally blind individuals, to provide them instruction in how to use computers and mobile devices with assistive technology, be it magnification software or screen reader software, so that they can pursue either higher education goals or vocational goals. I also do assessments of the students. I develop new curriculum for new programming that we do at the agency, and oversee a bunch of different programs that we have there. And when I'm not wearing that hat, I work with UsableNet, and I am the digital accessibility testing team lead there. So we have a team of people, individuals with different disabilities, and we provide testing to our clients on websites, both desktop and mobile, as well as native mobile applications, and give them feedback on the accessibility of their individual either sites or their applications.
Great, thanks, Joe. I mean, just as a summary, Erica's essentially recruiting, organizing, and help running user testing for different types of companies that come to Knowbility or AccessWorks. The slight difference with Joseph, he's also a user tester, because he's obviously he's blind and he relies on screen reader for every day, and he's part of the actual user testing team. So hopefully between the two of them, there'll be sort of a great perspective in terms of giving people guidance about how to get those resources more involved. I just want to first, again, sort of set expectations, because user testing can mean a lot of different things in the classic digital world. And I would say there's sort of three types of user testing with people with disabilities that we could talk about. And I want to sort of focus in to explain why we're going to primarily talk about the third group, and why that's the most popular with regard to companies currently that we engage with. And I'll get Erica to talk about what's mostly interested from her types of engagements. But user testing from a classic perspective is where essentially you get people to use a website and you observe them. If a company already does user testing in this way, it typically it leans towards larger organizations, typically leans towards where people are ideating or prototyping a new website or a new app. That user testing, what we would recommend is that a persona of someone who uses an assistive device is added to that user testing that you're already doing. We won't be talking too much about this type of classic user testing, where it's really sit back, watch, observe in this particular session, essentially because most of the companies that come to us typically have a need to understand whether the website that they've got, the app that they've got, can be used by different people with different assistive technology. And that's not classic user testing. That's essentially sort of functional testing. It's making sure that people can do that you expect them to do. The second user testing, which we won't talk about so much, is essentially where you may be lucky and hire accessibility experts that also use assistive technology. A good example of that is Joe De Niro. Joe De Niro could understand a website from a technical perspective in terms of whether it's following WCAG, a technical person, but he also uses an assistive device. These are people that aren't available in big volume. It's hard to find people who have that technical expertise with the need to use assistive technology. That's not to say they don't exist. If you go out there, many of the accessibility experts in a lot of the organizations use assistive technology as part of their day-to-day use. But it's hard to operate a user testing around trying to find 3, 4, or 5 of these people at once. So the type of user testing that we recommend and has very powerful output, and we'll talk about that, is targeted user journeys, essentially making sure that your website and app, people with different types of assistive technology can achieve the things that you expect an average user to do. So essentially, it's more targeted. It's more aimed at understanding whether someone can complete a task, and if they can't, where they get stuck in that task, and using that type of feedback mechanism to understand how well a website is working for people with that type of assistive technology, and what can be done. And we'll talk about how to take that user testing and then maybe dovetail that with people that understand the code side to give you back quality information about what to do, when to fix it. As I work for User One App, that's sort of like that's sort of Joe's input there. Erica, I wanted to check, the typical type of engagement you do. Where does it sit on this scale that I talk about in terms of the different types of user testing?
So typically what we're looking for is that targeted user testing with task completion. I think people are kind of looking for sort of the sweet spot in between technical and the more user experience, the emotions that might come with frustration of an inaccessible site, or enjoying a site that's accessible. Because when users are when they're doing the test on the actual website, then they're interacting with that same code that you're striving to get to be WCAG compliant. So they are interacting with all the technical, more, I guess, granular pieces of accessibility. But at the same time, they're approaching it as, okay, would I actually be able to make my purchase or do whatever I need to do on this site? And that's important that you mentioned the difference between expert accessibility testers from the disability community and this targeted user testing, because really the feedback that you're going to be getting, which is very powerful, is instead of these images here don't have good alt text, you get well, this is frustrating. I can't really tell what's on the page. So you are also getting outside of that technical aspect and getting into the user attitudes and feelings about the site as well.
Great, Erica. And actually, Joe, I did have a question here. When you're recruiting, what is the typical type of profile that you're looking for? We've talked about this, I know, before in other engagements, but I think it's good for people to understand, what are you looking for in a user tester when you're adding someone to a team?
Well, the one thing that's probably the most important that we look for, beyond the technical side of things is do these individuals use the type of sites that we test? So do they do banking online? Do they use e-commerce sites online? Do they use travel sites online? And that sort of thing, because those are the type of companies, not exclusively, but those are the types of companies that we're interacting with. So to kind of dovetail off of what Erica said, it's to add that personal experience to it. How do they feel as a user using this site, not just the technical side of things as well.
Great. So, and when you say the technical side, you mean that when someone comes to your team, someone might want a person that's using JAWS, for example, or someone's using Zoom, or a combination of different types of assistive technology. That's what we mean by
correct. Yes. Yep.
So just in summary there, what Erica and Joe's talking about is finding people that are quote unquote pro users and they use assistive technology on a day-to-day basis. That's going to give you people that understand the types of sites they're doing, the types of user tasks. They do those on a natural basis, and they can give feedback quite quickly on whether this is, is a struggle for them, because they do on a regular basis. They know when they're struggling on a site for example, buying a product, if they on a regular basis are buying products online. So why testing with disabilities? Why could this be something that actually helps you speed up your testing, speed up your remediation, and give you a quicker result? Because a lot of people might think that actually involving people with disabilities is going to add overhead, make it more expensive to create accessible digital experiences, make it a longer process. But actually, practically, in most cases, if you do user testing with people who use assistive technology on a daily basis, you can actually speed up your accessibility efforts. You can actually get remediation done quicker. And we'll give you some examples of that. But essentially, imagine it's practical. If you've got a website, you've got an app, and you don't know how accessible it is, if you have someone with assistive device, use that website to try and do what you would typically want to do on that site, and they can do it. You actually giving yourself a quick boost of feeling that you've already achieved a certain amount of accessibility. But also on the counter side is if they could rapidly tell you that they can't do things. We actually talk a lot about if you've got a limited budget, a limited amount of time, not to sound quick and dirty, but grab someone who uses a screen reader on a daily basis, do some automated testing. If you can do those two things and combine the results of just those two things and focus on removing any barriers that the user has and removing all of the things that you can find that are wrong with an automated tool, you will be putting your website in a very good place. And that's a quick way to get to a better place, rather than thinking about this as a layered onto additional processes. The idea of whether someone's using a website, records the problem, or records that they don't have a problem, that's good documentation. That's powerful documentation in this unfortunate world of things like digital lawsuits. If you've got screen reader users who confirm on a regular basis they can use your site and it's documented, that's good evidence that your site is in a good place if you ever get a claim that someone with a screen reader device can't use your website. And it also really helps create empathy. When technical people see that something can't be done by a particular group of users, they know that they're more motivated to fix that than a long list of issues that some tool found against the WCAG. And actually, Eric, I think you've got some good examples of how this sort of helps create empathy and action with inside a dev team.
Yeah, I do, and I'm excited to share those. I think I'm sharing them a bit later on, but I can definitely talk a bit about why we see our clients typically wanting to do this type of testing with users with disabilities. And I know you mentioned lawsuits, that's a key one, but I see more people coming in wanting testing as part of their overall accessibility strategy. So this is kind of getting more and more baked in, which is really exciting. And with that happening, we see more people coming in just kind of because they're keeping up with the Joneses. If you are a financial services company and you find out that your top two competitors have started doing accessibility testing and user testing with people with disabilities, and then your customers are starting to migrate over there because the site is more usable, you don't want them to eat your lunch because you're not doing accessibility. So I think people are starting to think of this as more of staying competitive rather than, fighting off lawsuits.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to hear that people are starting to put this in, and there is always this sort of range of companies are at different parts of their accessibility journey. And I always sort of advocate, but regardless of where you are on the accessibility journey, if this is the first time that you've thought about, well, how does someone use our website with a screen reader or with Zoom or other types of assistive technology, that's a great time to actually have someone do that and you experience it. At the same level, if you've been doing lots and lots of different types of programs and you've not used people with assistive technology, again, we advocate that this is something that you should add as a layer. The experience, Joe, I was going to bring you in here and talk about, like, what do you think is the simplest way to sort of quickly add people with assistive technology into a testing program that maybe already exists?
The simplest way to add, I mean, as far as where you're sourcing people?
No, in terms of, like, if people are doing testing already, how do you quickly add a user with assistive technology into that? Like, what's the in your experience in terms of the quickest way to do that?
We'll add them into the regular testing or the user personas that's already being maintained by a company, and just having them, be like any other user, and not put it in at the end, but get that feedback throughout the process of the development of a site.
Yeah, I love the idea of not overthinking this. To Joe's point, well, you're probably already doing testing of some case. You might be doing some testing where you have some people doing user testing, testing the functionality of journey. Add a persona in there, add a someone who's doing exactly the same thing as everybody else, but they happen to be using assistive technology to do it. That means that you're reusing lots of the things that you've already got there. If we move to the next slide, Bethany. I think that sort of brings us on to sort of, what should you include? What you should include in your testing program. So, maybe I'll get Erica to sort of go over the types of things that she does that will actually match up with what we've got on the slide. I'm only going to say what's on the slide to make sure that the captioner gets what's on the slide. Essentially, we identify sort of 3 broad sort of ways that you can sort of decide what to test, right? One, Joe mentioned it just now, which is match up with what you're already doing. That's an easy thing. That's you don't have to recreate sort of the types of testing that you're doing. Match up what you're already doing. Ad hoc testing is always really useful, meaning allow someone to say, go to the home page and explore and give us feedback on sort of like what do you think our services do, how do they work, but stay high level. And I think Erica will talk about this now a little bit. Stay high level, don't get into the code. I think Erica talked about it before, that we're not looking for people to dissect the code and give you code feedback. You want to give them sort of emotional feedback and success feedback. So Erica, maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say most of our testers are not equipped to give code feedback. If you remove the requirement for code feedback, then you also get a much wider range of people of different life experiences. You get, teachers and attorneys and stay-at-home parents and writers and, people who might necessarily not have ever touched code in their lives, but then they give you a wealth of different background. I think that it's very important, especially what you said about, matching the user journey with what you've tested with other users who might or might not have had a disability. Maybe they had a hidden disability and didn't indicate that. But, a big part of digital accessibility in general is making sure that people with disabilities have an equal experience. And if you are looking at, perhaps someone who's sighted going through a user flow, and then someone who's blind going through the same flow, you can see, well, is the information equal? Are the choices that both users can make equal? Are the outcomes equal? And that can help you really take why you're doing this back to the core reason for doing this type of testing and making sure your site is accessible.
And Joe, maybe you could give us slightly more, like, from your point of view or like your experience, how do you set up those, when someone comes and says, hey, we want you to do user testing, what is the process? You talked about user journeys. What's the process that goes on between maybe you and a project manager in terms of deciding what to test? How does that sort of structure itself?
So typically we would be given a new site. So the first thing is, as someone who may not have dealt with the particular site before, is what is the purpose of the site? So you're determining, what does this company do for a business, and get a feel for the site in of itself. Then it's looking, getting a feel for the structure of the site. And then from that, once we see what the purpose of the site is and kind of what the structure is, then we start to put together the user flows that probably most users on that site are going to typically do. And that's how we formulate the user flows for the project, for the specific project.
And you work, so you work in sort of tandem with a project manager, and then how does that relationship work typically?
Well, the project manager is kind of the go-between between the testers and the dev team. So we work in tandem with him or her to put things together on the front end, and then obviously once we go into testing, there's sort of the communication between us and the dev team, because dev team might have questions about feedback that we may provide, and they want further information, and we work with the project manager on the best way to give them further information based on some of the results that we would provide.
And Erica, is that similar in terms of how you work with a client? Let's say you do some user testing, certain feedback gets given in. How does that then sort of get back into the client? In what sort of format does that get put back into the client?
It varies depending on what the client wants. Sometimes they want more of an aggregated report. Sometimes they want the raw video footage. But I guess, touching back on some of the examples you talked about with the strategy, one of the most powerful things that people will do, sometimes the project manager, is they'll grab particular video clips or quotes and send them right to the developer, because nothing can be more motivating sometimes than actually seeing someone running into a feature on the site that does not work with their assistive technology, and watching that happen in real time can be kind of a wake-up call. So it depends. Sometimes it's just that little snippet that they really need to change small things. And sometimes it's a larger report where it's, okay, we're going to look at this whole user flow. How can we fine tune it and make it better? So it really varies, but there's advantages to both, I would say.
I think I love your example of, the motivating video to sort of get a technical team to realize that there's a barrier, because technical people typically are motivated to fix, technical things. They don't like seeing that their website or their app can't be used by a typical group, and they will find a solution. As I said before, I think that's a lot more powerful as a medium than a list of WCAG missing alt tags, labels, and other things where it's almost like someone's correcting someone's essay, as opposed to saying, well, I didn't understand the point of this story, which is the difference between a user tester that sort of is emotionally experiencing something and trying to do something, as opposed to someone who's trying to correct work. So I think it's a lot more motivating for a technical team. Can we move to the next slide, Bethany? So we've talked a lot about when we can do user testing. I'm going to focus in and ask Erica and Joe sort of when those teams are most used. But you can, as I said, you can use them, in a many ways. The most sort of common way that we would encourage people, especially if you've got a production website or app that you're concerned that hasn't been tested for assistive technology, hasn't been tested for accessibility, and you've not done much in the past, is to potentially correct what you can based on the WCAG. Use a code review to actually get the site in a place where you feel like you've followed the WCAG as best you can, and then bring in user testers. I think Erica's got some good examples of where she's and her team's been used in like early upfront activity to establish blockers. That's also another way. It's like I need to get some buy-in here. I need to get some motivation going around. We need to do more about accessibility. Let me get one or two assistive users to video using their site, show that there's blockers. That might help you as an organization get more attention on this particular subject. Obviously, what we would recommend is that anytime you've done remediation, user testing should be part of that sort of verification. As much as you can use user testing before you do major releases, as part of release management. And if that's not possible, and we'll talk about some of the challenges there, making sure that you're doing a post-release user testing with disability group. Erica, maybe one of those you'd like sort of maybe to pull out and focus on?
Oh, I actually have two, but they're good ones.
Perfect.
And one I'm really excited to talk about because I see Herman and Casey in the Q&A were asking about discovery and design stage. And we actually had a really cool experience where we recruited participants for an ideation workshop with a large company who was developing a new app. So there was nothing, it was all brainstorming and planning and working in teams. And I would say that our participants loved it. They found it to be really exciting work. It was exciting for the people in the company they were working with. And one piece of feedback I got from our participants was, wow, I mean, this is really, I feel like this is that nothing about us without us. How exciting that we're getting to make some decisions here and not waiting till the end. I realize that's not possible all the time, but that really generated a lot of goodwill and got a lot of buy-in from the group. And it was also a good learning experience for the company about how to set up those types of sessions for the future. I think we're going to get into some of those considerations later. So that absolutely can be done with some planning. But I want to talk also about an experience we had recruiting participants for testing a live site, which is pretty common. It's what we get the most of. And we encountered a significant screen reader incompatibility issue. People were supposed to enter numbers like a phone number or an address number, things like that. And the field that they were putting the numbers into was scrambling them somehow, and it would read back numbers incorrectly over the screen reader, which was a huge frustration. People couldn't tell if they'd actually entered the right thing. And we documented all of this for the client. And that was something they really needed to rush to fix in a big hurry. So the key thing there is when you're testing a live site, make sure that you have a plan in place and a time budget and personnel budget in mind for fixing things as you find them.
Yeah, great inputs. And also, I mean, I was going to ask Joe, let's say a company says like, well, we've got limited resources, limited time, and typically, obviously, I know that your team works with a lot of sort of e-commerce sites and banking sites and stuff. If you said like, what should you focus on in terms of things to make sure that you're testing early, and what would they be?
So for example, for an e-commerce site, you want to focus on, again, the top five, top 6 things that are done on a website. So account registration, search, so the ability to find a product on a website, either via search or via navigation, and then the corresponding product listing pages, the product description pages, and then most importantly, does the person have the ability, once they're on a product description page, to add that item to the cart, and are they able to check out? Those would be the top things we would look at on an e-commerce site, or some of the things.
I think what we could collectively call that is sort of interactions. I think, and Erica's point about where she found that screen readers were having significant problems was an interaction component, and that's because essentially those types of components or functions on a website are built in a range of different code. It's not classic HTML. It's not static code. It's dynamically generated. It can be done in a range of ways, and those are the ones which are they're going to be the big trip ups. They're going to be the components that aren't straightforward to easily test in other ways, and aren't straightforward to fix if they're not done well up front. So making sure that you're trying to test as much of the interaction components on a website as possible, as early as possible with screen readers, will make this a far more palatable fix, because it's a lot easier to fix it early rather than late. So I know we're getting towards the end, and we've only got 2 more slides. So I wanted to talk about, okay, so what are the challenges? It sounds great. We should all do it. Let's go get a bunch of users with assistive technology. Let's start testing. What are the sort of potential sort of challenges that you should keep in mind when you're thinking about adding this as a component? And I'm gonna list the 3 that we're built under, and I'll maybe get each of the guys to talk about. So one is technical setup. One is feedback sort of structure and mechanism. So how do you get that feedback back into the team to actually be useful? And then are there financial challenges? So I was actually going to get just to change the order. I'm just going to get Joe maybe to talk about some of the technical considerations that you've got to take into account when you want to bring people with assistive technology into that testing environment.
So first is the actual the setup for the individual. Ideally, you would want to have someone with using their own equipment, because they've configured the assistive technology the way that they want to set it have it set up, and they have all their settings within either the screen reader or the magnification software, so they don't have to go into a new computer and reset that setup. Another technical consideration would be if you're working on in a staging environment or VPN, making sure that it is set up so that an individual with a disability can access it. So there's no hangups with screen reader in particular user.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about, I think, Erica, you've also got inputs, because there's different ways you can allow people to go do their user testing and give you the content feedback. There's ways where you can say, hey, we're gonna, here's all the tasks that we want you to try to do. Go do it on your own time. Give us a sort of a feedback on each one of the sort of user tasks. We might set up a session where we'll go live in Zoom to record any issues that you say, hey, I couldn't do this. Okay, can you join us on a Zoom call and sort of record that for the client? Erica, other technical considerations? Because I think we tend to use Zoom because it's one of the most sort of accessible environments. Do you use the same, or have you found different types of environments more accessible than others when it comes to like recording user feedback?
We also use Zoom. Sometimes I feel like we have to say, no, we're not sponsored by Zoom, but we find Zoom to be very accessible. If people want to use a different tool, we pretty much put out that we want to test that first before we move forward, because that's such a key part. Other issues that we've noted with the technical side, and I guess this is more on the material side. I do want to talk about this because I saw some folks in the Q&A talking about prototypes or wireframes, things like that. Making sure that those are interactive and accessible, that there's a way to add alternative text and things like that. We have found that the more coding there is, even if it's just like a very bare bones website or web page, the better. Image-based testing will not work for screen reader users without proper description of what's in the images. And if it's not navigable with the tab, then that will eliminate a lot of users from participating. So just some things to keep in mind. Go over your prototypes and wireframes with a fine-tooth comb if that's the route you're going to go. And then also things like NDAs, consent forms, if you're sending those in a PDF, those should be accessible. And then one thing that I've kind of had to learn on my own is when I'm on Zoom and I'm talking with a participant and I want them to share their screen so I can see how they're getting through the website. And if they say, oh, can you remind me, how do I share my screen? I've had to learn how to make my instructions not visually based. For example, if I say, oh, well, no problem, it's just a little green square with an up arrow, that's not going to work for a blind screen reader user. I need to say, okay, well, there's going to be a menu that starts with mute, then start video, then participants and share screen. And visually it's at the bottom of my screen. So they can, start navigating to that spot without looking for a green square, which is not helpful instruction. Live and learn.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'll just cover a couple of examples in the other two, like the feedback structure and the financial challenges. When we talk about feedback structure, obviously what you want is the wording and the communication that the users use about what they're doing or they're not doing or they're having problems with can be then actioned by the rest of your team to remediate. So, obviously we have a group of people that do this on a regular basis, and we sort of go through sort of terminology to use and sort of directions on how to sort of describe different types of issues, because then the dev teams that might look at that code, you know, can understand exactly what the feedback's coming from. So there is a, you know, it's not always easy to grab brand new people to talk about their experiences on the website and then take that and make it productive for the rest of the team, because there's actually a sort of disconnect on terminology and how people describe things. So once you have people working with you, I would encourage you to, you know, if you go hire people, you know, hire people for a long period for multiple projects. So over time, actually that sort of qualitative communication becomes tighter and tighter between the different groups, as opposed to sort of every time grabbing a brand new set of users, because you're going to waste a lot of time sort of interpreting the feedback in some situations. And there's always to bear in mind, financial considerations might be, for example, many people who rely on assistive technology may have limited number of hours that they can work for a range of reasons. So making sure that you tailor the program to make sure that you're attracting the broadest number of people who could actually apply and help you in this project, rather than make it, for example, a full-time position, which will be very hard for many of the disability community to take on. You want to maybe give as much opportunity as possible in terms of sort of dovetailing the program, and actually that sort of leads me to, well, where can you find different resources? And that's the final slide. So the final slide really talks about, well, where could you find different types of resources that could help you with a program? So Bethany, can you go to the final slide? You know, you're listening to two organizations that sort of do this on a day-to-day basis for lots of other organizations. So there are companies that you can come to and say, hi, we want to do user testing. You have a pool of people. You have a mechanism to set that up. You have a mechanism to run that. That typically obviously works better for larger organizations that can afford to engage a group of people that are being hired to do that work. But there's lots of possibilities to find different organizations or people within inside your also community. The first thing I talk about is reaching out within inside your employee network, friends and family of his employees, your community, your customers, to find people who would be interested in becoming part of a user testing session. That's a very affordable and very sort of community orientated way of getting feedback and starting this type of program. There's different levels of organizations. There's lots of, there's a number of nonprofits like the Lighthouse for the Blind and different organizations. Erica, I know you've got sort of a Rolodex of companies. What other sort of suggestions have you got with regard to where people could find resources?
So I can tell you, there are definitely some social media groups that I start with if I'm in a hurry, but then you kind of need to vet who you're getting, because, you know, if you get someone who might not be a great fit and they're just looking for, oh my gosh, you know, I need some money right away. I found this paid testing opportunity. So that can be a good, like, very short term if you have time to vet everyone. But really what I like to do is reach out to community organizations that serve people with disabilities and, you know, start building ongoing relationships. And that could be Lighthouse for the Blind. If you have a wheelchair basketball team, if you have, you know, a group, you know, in Austin where I live, there's a deaf gaming group. Just look around your community and, you know, tell people who you are, what you're trying to do, and then ask if anyone would be interested in helping you out. We have a wonderful ASL interpreter who we work with at our conferences and things like that. She's helped us reach out to her community when we were looking for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. That was great. And, if you have someone who's joined your program and they say, oh, well, I'm part of my NFB chapter. Can I reach out to other people in my chapter? I teach at a school for the blind and visually impaired. Can I ask my coworkers? That person's going to be your best friend because they're going to help you bring more people in, and they can already talk about their experience as a tester. So, don't be afraid to reach out to the broader community. I've even had people recommend their friends and neighbors, things like that. So it's almost kind of like trying to set your friends up on a date in a way, just, oh, well, would you be interested in this? And then putting that out. But definitely it's more of a, what you said, Jason, about bringing the same people back. If you can set this up as an ongoing relationship, I think that's the best thing. And I did see a couple comments about, really being on a budget and, where do you start? And I would say a critical thing is if you can pay your participants, that's central, and then, see what you can cost out apart from that. We like to pay our participants not with gift cards. We'll send PayPal or Zelle, because we found that, if you give people this, gift certificate to this great, ice cream parlor in your town, what if their website's not accessible and people are trying to, read the menu, things like that, and they can't do it. So cash is king. Everyone likes that. But I think that that's really the way to start budgeting if you're on a tight budget, is my recommendation.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, just to give people a sort of range, you should probably be thinking paying someone around $20 to $30 an hour to do this type of work at the sort of entry level. You want people who are professionally orientated in terms of, and you want to pay in that way because you want people who can give you great feedback. The other thing I think is very important is to set a time limit, because that will actually help you with the budget, which is, well, actually, we want you to test 5 things. We want you to sign up for an account. We want you to search for a product and add it to cart. These are types of user tasks. And we don't want you to spend more than 30 minutes trying to do it and 30 minutes describing what happened. That's a way to sort of like put a ring fence around it. So it's not like something that you feel like someone's going to be doing this for a day. That's how you ring fence around sort of what your expectation levels are. Because Joe will talk about this. If someone's taking over half an hour to do a particular task, well, the task is too complicated for them to do, or it's got problems. So we need to. There's another thing that needs to happen. So that's another way to sort of ring fence around costs, is to make sure that you know exactly sort of what you expect and communicate that with someone. And again, Joe talked about this. Letting people use their own technology, that makes it faster for them. Maybe even allow them to do it. We've got testers who do a lot of their testing at 2 o'clock in the morning, because that's a good time for them. That's when they like to do some extra work. So being flexible about when allow people to do testing as well is important. I want to make sure we get to some questions. That was the end, really. And really thank you, Erica and Joe, so far. But also, Bethany, maybe you can put out some questions that Erica hasn't due diligently been looking at already, that maybe we can get to. A note on questions. If we don't get to them, we'll definitely answer them. We know who actually sent the questions due to Zoom, and we will send out the answers to them. So don't feel shy to put in because you don't think we've got enough time. Bethany, maybe you can pull questions out that fit very much for Erica and Joe.
Yeah, actually, we did a pretty good job of answering these waste questions. I'm just looking through them. A lot of questions about accessibility testing on prototypes. Someone asked, what about doing user testing with people with disabilities in the design stage? Prototype testing, discovery.
Yeah, on the prototype front as well. I mean, Erica did a great job of this describing. You've got to make sure this, if you want screen reader users to give you feedback, they've got to be able to use the prototype. The easy way to test that is just make sure that you can tab order through all of the interactive elements, and you can sound aloud those using VoiceOver on Mac. Most prototypers are on Mac now anyway, so you should have a good idea that that prototype is tabbable, keyboard controlled, and can give you an indication of what the action is before selecting.
I did see a couple questions. Jack, I think I actually have your email address. I'm going to email you our information about our testing program. And Lizzie, I'm just learning how to use Figma myself. So unfortunately, I don't have any Figma tips. But I read an interesting article about someone using like Word documents to make really text-based wireframes and prototypes where everything was written out as a description. So I'm not sure exactly, how complex your Figma is, but that might be an option if you're having a hard time getting the tagging to work. Maybe setting it up in a completely different format, like a Word document, might be worth exploring.
Great. Okay. And with that, we'll conclude our webinar. Thank you, everyone, for joining. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us.